Neon buzzed like a dying wasp outside the diner window. Grease coated every surface, thick enough to scrape with a fingernail. Nobody working the graveyard shift expects salvation. They expect drunks, drifters, and trouble. Trouble walked in wearing heavy leather, smelling of exhaust, demanding a meal that almost ended in murder. Cassidy's arches were on fire. She leaned her hip against the stainless steel counter, letting the cold metal seep through her thin polyester apron. It was 2 in the morning on a Tuesday. The air inside the Rustler's Roost tasted of burnt filter coffee, industrial floor wax, and the stale desperation of people who had nowhere else to be. Behind the line, Wyatt was scraping the flat-top grill with a heavy metal spatula. Shk, shk, shk. The sound grated against Cassidy's exhausted nerves. Wyatt was a miserable bastard on a good day. Tonight, he was tweaking, sweating profusely, his jaw grinding, his pale eyes darting at the shadows dancing on the highway outside. Then, the floorboards began to vibrate. It started as a low hum in the baseboards, vibrating up through the sticky linoleum, rattling the cheap ceramic mugs stacked by the register. The hum swelled into a deafening, chest-rattling roar. Headlights swept across the blinds, casting long, distorted shadows across the empty booths. Cassidy pushed off the counter. The 3 truckers eating in the corner booth stopped chewing. Silence dropped over the diner like a wet wool blanket, suffocating and heavy, broken only by the dying rumble of 6 massive motorcycle engines shutting off in unison. The front door opened. The bell above it chimed a cheerful, pathetic little sound. They walked in, 6 of them, Hell's Angels. Cassidy didn't need to read the winged death head patches on their backs to know what they were. It was in the way they took up space. They didn't walk into the room. They occupied it. The smell hit her immediately. Ozone, hot engine metal, unwashed denim, old sweat, and damp leather. The man in the lead was massive. Not gym-built, but functionally huge, like a battered oak tree. A thick, graying beard swallowed the lower half of his face, and his nose had clearly been broken more than once, and left to set crooked. He didn't look around to assess threats. He didn't care. He just slid into the largest booth, the cracked red vinyl groaning under his weight. Cassidy swallowed hard. Her mouth tasted like old pennies. She grabbed a fresh pot of coffee and walked over. Her hands betrayed her, shaking just enough to make the brown liquid tremble against the glass. "Coffee?" she asked. Her voice sounded thin. The big man looked up. His eyes were flat, dead. There was no warmth in them, no anger either. Just a chilling, absolute neutrality. "Black," he said. His voice was gravel grinding in a cement mixer, and the chili burger. "Double meat, don't burn it." "Yes, sir." She poured the coffee, leaving the pot on the table, and retreated to the kitchen. She slapped the ticket onto the metal rail above the prep station. Wyatt snatched it. He stared at the handwritten letters, then looked through the serving window at the booth. His jaw worked furiously. Wyatt hated bikers. A club had put his older brother in a wheelchair 5 years ago over a bad meth debt. Cassidy knew the story. Everyone in the county knew the story. "Double chili burger," Wyatt muttered, his voice a tight, high-pitched hiss. "Yeah, sure." Cassidy turned away to wipe down the counter, her mind numb, praying for the end of her shift. She didn't want to look at the Hell's Angels. She didn't want to look at Wyatt. She just wanted her meager tips and her sagging mattress. 10 minutes later, the bell on the serving line dinged. Cassidy walked over. The burger sat on a chipped ceramic plate. It was a monstrous thing, 2 thick, greasy patties drowning in dark, reddish-brown chili, topped with violently yellow cheese. But there was something else. Cassidy's eyes dropped to the prep counter next to the grill. Earlier that night, a heavy coffee mug had shattered on the floor. Wyatt had swept it up. Now, the dustpan was sitting on the prep table, empty. Next to it was the heavy mallet Wyatt used to tenderize chicken breasts. The metal head of the mallet was dusted with a fine, chalky white powder. Cassidy looked back at the burger. Embedded in the thick chili, barely visible beneath the melted cheese, was a tiny, jagged glint of white porcelain. Her stomach dropped into her shoes. A cold sweat erupted across the back of her neck. He hadn't just spit in it. He hadn't just dropped it on the floor. Wyatt had pulverized the broken mug and mixed the razor-sharp ceramic shards directly into the chili paste. It was a death sentence. It would tear the biker's throat and stomach to bloody ribbons. Take it, Wyatt hissed, leaning over the counter. His pupils were dilated, black and massive. He smelled like sour onions and fear. Serve it, Cass. Wyatt, you can't. Serve it, he whispered violently, his hand dropping to the heavy slicing knife on the cutting board. Or, I swear to God, you'll be wearing it. Cassidy couldn't breathe. The diner felt completely devoid of oxygen. She picked up the plate. The ceramic felt incredibly heavy. It burned her fingers. She walked toward the booth. Every step was agonizing. The truckers in the corner were watching her. The bikers were talking in low, rumbling tones. Just put it down, a cynical voice in her head whispered. It's not your problem. Let them kill each other. You need this job. You need to pay rent. If you speak up, Wyatt will hurt you. If you don't, the biker dies. She reached the table. The big man, the one with the crooked nose, stopped talking. He looked at the plate, then up at her. Cassidy set the plate down on the sticky Formica table. The heavy thud of the ceramic sounded like a gunshot in her own ears. The biker picked up the burger. Both hands. He brought it toward his face. Cassidy squeezed her eyes shut. She thought of the porcelain tearing through his esophagus. She thought of the blood, the hacking, the choking, the sheer, unadulterated violence that would follow when his brothers realized what had happened. They would lock the doors. They would burn the rustler's roost to the foundation, and she would be inside it. Her survival instinct snapped, not out of heroism, out of raw, primal panic. Sir, don't eat that. The words tore out of her throat, too loud, cracking halfway through. The big man froze. The burger was 2 inches from his mouth. A dollop of greasy chili dripped from the bun and hit the plate with a wet, sickening splat. The entire diner went dead silent. The low hum of the refrigerator in the back suddenly sounded like a jet engine. The other 5 Hell's Angels stopped moving. 10 heavy, dangerous eyes locked onto Cassidy. She immediately regretted it. The sheer weight of their attention made her want to curl into a ball and vomit. Her knees shook so violently they knocked against the edge of the table. The big man slowly lowered the burger back onto the plate. He didn't blink. He just stared at her, his expression utterly unreadable. Why? He asked. The word was soft. It wasn't a question. It was a demand. Cassidy's throat closed up. She tried to speak, but only a pathetic wheeze came out. She raised a trembling finger and pointed blindly toward the kitchen window, where Wyatt was currently standing, frozen like a rabbit in headlights. Cassidy swallowed down a surge of bile. There's crushed glass in the chili. The silence that followed was suffocating. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but to Cassidy, it stretched into an eternity. The big man looked down at his plate. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for a stainless steel fork wrapped in a cheap paper napkin. He pulled the fork out. With terrifying calm, he pressed the tines into the top bun and scraped it back, exposing the steaming chili and cheese. He pressed the fork down into the meat and dragged it sideways. Skrrr. The horrific sound of metal grinding against jagged ceramic echoed through the room. The big man stopped. He used the exit again to the chili, lifting a chunk of meat. Embedded within it was a triangular shard of a broken coffee mug, edges razor sharp, glinting wetly under the fluorescent lights. He stared at it for a long moment. Then, he set the fork down. He didn't yell. He didn't throw the plate. He just looked across the diner at the serving window. Wyatt was already gone. The space behind the counter was empty. The big man stood up. The vinyl booth squeaked. He looked down at Cassidy. She was shrinking back, tears of pure terror welling in her eyes, her hands covering her mouth. She expected him to hit her. She expected him to pull a gun. Instead, he looked at 2 of the men sitting across from him. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The 2 bikers stood up. They were younger, broader in the shoulders, wearing heavy steel-toed boots. They walked past Cassidy. They didn't run. They didn't rush. Their movements were cold, methodical, and profoundly terrifying. They stepped behind the counter. Cassidy collapsed against the wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the dirty floor. She pulled her knees to her chest and covered her ears. She didn't want to hear it, but she did. From the kitchen came the clatter of pans falling. Then, Wyatt's voice, high and thin, screaming something about a knife. It was cut short by a dull, wet thud. It sounded like a butcher dropping a slab of ribs onto a wooden block. Cassidy squeezed her eyes shut. The smells of the diner, the bleach, the old gum under the counter, the burnt coffee suddenly smelled metallic and sweet. The copper tang of blood was filling the air. More sounds followed. Not the chaotic, cinematic sounds of a bar brawl. It was a one-sided slaughter. It was the horrific, rhythmic sound of heavy boots making contact with soft tissue and bone. Thwack, crack, thwack. Wyatt was crying now. Gurgling. Begging. Please. A wet, bubbling voice pleaded from the kitchen. Please. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Another heavy thud. The sizzle of the flat-top grill hissed violently, followed by a scream so agonizing it made Cassidy's teeth ache. Wyatt had been pushed onto the iron. Cassidy curled tighter, silently sobbing, her nails digging into her own arms until they bled. She was a coward. She knew it. She had caused this. She had saved a man's life, but she had condemned another to a butchering. The internal contradiction tore at her. She hated Wyatt. He was cruel and vicious, but nobody deserved to be taken apart like this. Footsteps approached, heavy, squeaking slightly on the greasy linoleum. Cassidy opened her eyes. The two younger bikers emerged from the kitchen. They were dragging Wyatt by his ankles. Cassidy gagged. Wyatt's face was a ruined landscape of purple and red. His nose was flattened across his cheek. The left side of his face was a blistering, weeping mess of burns from the grill. He wasn't crying anymore. He was just blowing bloody bubbles from his mouth. His eyes rolled back in his head. They dragged him across the floor, leaving a thick, dark smear of blood across the cracked white tiles. They hauled him out the front door, the cheerful little bell chiming overhead. The big man, the one with the crooked nose, was still standing by the booth. He hadn't moved. He reached into his leather vest and pulled out a thick money clip. He peeled off a $100 bill and tossed it onto the table, right next to the poisoned burger. He walked over to where Cassidy was cowering on the floor. He towered above her, blocking out the light. Cassidy stared at his boots, bracing herself. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't thank her. He didn't say she was brave. He knew exactly what she was, a terrified, exhausted woman who had just barely avoided being collateral damage. He looked down at the blood trailing across the floor. "Get him up," he rumbled. He turned and walked out the door. The bell chimed. Outside, the heavy engines roared to life, shaking the diner one last time, before fading away down Highway 9, leaving Cassidy alone with the silence, the smell of burnt flesh, and a $100 bill resting next to a plate of broken glass. The water in the yellow plastic bucket turned a cloudy, sickening pink. Cassidy plunged the heavy cotton mop head into the wringer, leaning her entire body weight on the rusted iron lever. The water gushed out, slapping against the plastic sides with a hollow, rhythmic splash. It was the only sound left in the Rustler's Roost. The three truckers had vanished. They hadn't stayed to give statements, and they certainly hadn't stayed to help. They had left exact change on their table, slipping out the side door the moment the heavy leather boots dragged Wyatt over the threshold. That was the unwritten rule of the night shift on Highway 9. You don't see what you don't want to explain. Cassidy pushed the mop across the cracked white linoleum. The blood was stubborn. It had started to coagulate, pooling in the recessed grout lines, turning sticky and dark. She poured straight, undiluted bleach onto the floor. The harsh chemical fumes hit the back of her throat, burning her nasal passages, cutting sharply through the sweet, metallic stench of violence. Her eyes watered, blurring the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. She scrubbed. Her shoulders ached with a dull, throbbing intensity. Her cheap, rubber-soled shoes squeaked against the wet floor. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Every time she blinked, she saw the big man's crooked nose. She heard the sound of the metal fork scraping against the jagged porcelain. She heard Wyatt's bubbling, pathetic screams. Her right hand drifted to the pocket of her polyester apron. Her fingers brushed against the crisp, heavy paper of the $100 bill. She hadn't left it on the table. She had snatched it up before getting the mop, folding it tightly, hiding it away like a stolen secret. It felt heavy against her hip. Blood money. Hush money. A tip. She didn't know what it was, but she knew she needed to pay her gas bill. Guilt and survival warred in her chest, a toxic cocktail that made her stomach churn. 20 minutes later, the flashing lights arrived. They didn't come with sirens, just the silent, frantic sweeping of red and blue strobes, cutting through the grease-stained windows, illuminating the dust motes, dancing in the diner's dead air. Cassidy dropped the mop handle. It hit the floor with a clatter. She wiped her trembling hands on her stained apron and walked toward the front doors. They had found Wyatt. Two county sheriff's cruisers were parked at irregular angles near the overflowing dumpsters at the edge of the lot. Flashlights cut through the darkness, moving in sharp, jerky arcs. Cassidy stood behind the glass door, watching. Paramedics arrived shortly after, their boots crunching on the loose gravel. They loaded a limp, groaning shape onto a stretcher. Even from a distance, under the harsh glare of the ambulance floodlights, Cassidy could see the angry, blistering red weeping across the side of Wyatt's face. The diner's bell chimed. A deputy walked in. He looked to be in his late 50s, carrying an extra 40 pounds around his midsection, his uniform shirt stretching taut over his belt. He took off his peaked hat and wiped a hand across his sweating forehead. He smelled like cheap mint gum and stale tobacco. "You the only one working?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of any real curiosity. He pulled a small, spiral-bound notepad from his breast pocket. "Yes," Cassidy said. Her voice felt like dry leaves rasping together. "Name? Cassidy. Cassidy Miller." The deputy scribbled. He didn't look at her. "Got a mess out back. Your cook, Wyatt, right? Paramedics say somebody beat him halfway to death. Burned his face on something. Says he fell." Cassidy stared at the deputy's pen, the blue ink bleeding slightly into the cheap paper. "Says he fell." Wyatt wasn't talking. Wyatt knew better. If you told the cops about a patch club, they didn't just come back for you. They came back for your family. They burned your house down while you slept. The cops took a statement and drove away. The club lived in the shadows. "I was in the back," Cassidy lied. The words tasted like ash. "In the walk-in freezer, doing inventory. I didn't hear anything." The deputy stopped writing. He finally looked up. His eyes were tired, bloodshot, scanning the diner. He looked at the wet, pink-tinged floor. He looked at the yellow mop bucket. He looked at the plate still sitting on the booth table, a half-eaten burger surrounded by chunks of sharp, white ceramic. He walked over to the booth. He stared down at the plate for a long, quiet moment. He reached out with a pen and nudged a piece of the broken mug. It clicked against the plate. Cassidy stopped breathing. She felt the sweat turning to ice on her back. If he asked about the plate, if he pressed her, she would break. She didn't have the fortitude for an interrogation. She was 24, subsisting on 4 hours of sleep a day and a diet of discarded French fries. The deputy sighed. It was a heavy, rattling sound that came from deep within his chest. He looked from the poisoned burger to the wet mop, and finally back to Cassidy. He understood. He didn't need forensics to read the room. A tweaked-out cook, a terrified waitress, a table full of glass, and a body dumped by the trash. The math was simple, and the jurisdiction was messy. He was 2 years from a pension and had no interest in chasing ghosts down the interstate over a scumbag meth addict who tried to play God with a meat mallet. "All right," the deputy said, flipping his notepad shut. "Make sure you lock up tight tonight, Cassidy. Lot of stray dogs wandering the highway." "I will," she whispered. He turned and walked out. The bell chimed. Cassidy stood alone in the center of the diner. She squeezed her eyes shut, a single, hot tear cutting a clean line down her dusty cheek. She wasn't relieved. She felt incredibly, profoundly dirty. She had survived, but survival, she was learning, required leaving pieces of your soul on the sticky linoleum. The sun didn't rise. It just sort of bled over the horizon. The sky turned a bruised, sickly shade of purple before washing out into a harsh, unforgiving gray. It was 6:30 in the morning. The graveyard shift was officially over. Cassidy was sitting on a plastic milk crate behind the counter, staring blankly at the wall. The diner smelled intensely of industrial bleach and the cheap, burnt sugar smell of the pancake batter she had prepped for the morning rush. The floor was dry, leaving chalky white streaks where the chemical cleaner had settled. Tires crunched heavily on the gravel outside. The low, sputtering idle of a 2004 Ford Taurus signaled the arrival of Gary, the owner of the Rustler's Roost. The front door banged open. Gary marched in, clutching a heavy ring of keys and a massive travel mug. He was a small, tightly wound man who wore dress shirts with grease stains on the cuffs and carried an air of perpetual, defensive outrage. He took 3 steps into the diner and stopped. He looked at the floor, then at the empty prep station. "Where the hell is Wyatt?" Gary barked. His voice was sharp, a grating bark that made the base of Cassidy's skull throb. Cassidy didn't stand up. She just looked at him from her milk crate. "Hospital," she said, her voice completely hollow. Gary blinked, his face twisting in annoyance. "Hospital? What the hell for? He's supposed to be dropping the hash browns for the breakfast rush. I got 2 buses from the senior center pulling in at 8. Somebody beat him up," Cassidy said. She kept her sentences short, conserving energy. Every muscle in her body felt like it had been filled with lead shot. Dragged him out back, pushed his face onto the flat top. Gary's eyes darted toward the kitchen. He marched over to the serving window and leaned in, inspecting the heavy iron grill. "Jesus Christ," Gary snapped, slapping his hand against the stainless steel framing. "Did they scratch the iron? Did you clean the grease traps? Health inspector is due this month, Cass. If they find blood near the line, they'll shut me down." He didn't ask if Wyatt was alive. He didn't ask if Cassidy was hurt. He was staring at his cooking equipment, doing panicked mental math on profit margins and liability. Cassidy watched him. A strange, heavy calm began to settle over her. It was the absolute clarity of utter exhaustion. For 2 years, she had worked in this diner. She had burned her arms on the steam wands, taken insults from drunk truckers, scrubbed vomit out of the urinals, and handed over half her tips to a cook who used them to buy pseudoephedrine. She had done it because she was afraid of missing rent, afraid of her landlord, afraid of the vast, uncaring void of poverty waiting just outside the front door. But last night, the void had walked inside. It had worn heavy leather and ordered a chili burger. It had shown her exactly how fragile the whole arrangement was. "Look," Gary said, turning back to her, running a frantic hand through his thinning hair. "You're going to have to cover the line. I'll work the register. Just throw on an apron over your shirt. Keep the menu simple. Eggs, bacon, toast. We push through the lunch rush, and I'll make some calls to see if I can get Hector to cover the night." He waved his hand dismissively, already moving toward the back office to check the safe. "Come on, Chop Chop. Coffee's not going to brew itself." Cassidy looked down at her hands. Her cuticles were raw, the skin cracked from the bleach. She could still smell the copper tang of Wyatt's blood caught in the fibers of her shirt. She stood up. Her knees popped loudly in the quiet diner. She reached behind her back and unknotted the string of her apron. The polyester fabric fell away. She picked it up and draped it over the cash register. Gary stopped at the office door. He turned around, frowning. "What are you doing?" "I told you, you need to work the grill. I'm going home." Gary's face flushed a deep, ugly red. "The hell you are! You walk out now, right before the morning rush. And you're done, Cassidy. I mean it. I won't hire you back. You won't get a dime of severance." Cassidy reached into the pocket of her jeans, her fingers wrapped around the folded paper. She pulled it out and smoothed it down against her thigh. A crisp, $100 bill. Benjamin Franklin staring back at her with silent, stoic indifference. It was more than Gary paid her for a 50-hour work week. It was blood money. It was survival money. It was a ticket out of the graveyard shift. She didn't throw it in Gary's face. She didn't give him a triumphant speech about dignity or morality. She was too tired for theatrics, and Gary wouldn't understand them anyway. "Keep my last check," Cassidy said, her voice dropping to a quiet, steady murmur. "Use it to hire someone to clean the grill. I didn't get all the skin off the iron." Gary blanched. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sick and suddenly very old under the fluorescent lights. He took a step back, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. Cassidy turned her back on him. She walked past the empty booths, past the table where a shattered ceramic mug still lay buried in congealed chili, and pushed open the glass door. The morning air hit her like a physical blow. It was cold, carrying the smell of wet asphalt, diesel exhaust, and blooming sagebrush from the highway median. The rumble of early morning traffic was starting to build, an endless, metallic river flowing toward the horizon. She zipped up her thin jacket against the chill. She didn't have a car. It was a 2-mile walk down the shoulder of Highway 9 to her apartment. Cassidy stepped onto the gravel. She shoved the $100 bill deep into her pocket, wrapped her hand around it, and started walking. She didn't look back at the rustler's roost. She just kept her eyes on the cracked white line painted on the edge of the road, putting one squeaking rubber sole in front of the other, moving forward until the neon buzz of the diner faded completely into the roar of the highway.